Welcome, everyone. I'm Sabina Vaught, and I'm so honored to be welcoming all of you to our inaugural event for a year of considering education and the Black Fantastic. I want to thank the team involved in the work, Dr. Elon Dancy, who is my collaborator and intellectual political partner in this project, our dedicated teachers and brilliant scholars, Dr. Martez Files and doctoral student Chris Wright, and the ever amazing Caitlin Zerker, Emily Conklin, and Christy McGuire, who really tirelessly and very skillfully coordinate, support, organize, and publicize all the work. And also thanks to our newest team member, Janelle Levy, who will be guiding the scholarly projects this year. And finally, thank you to the McElhatton Foundation for their support of this work. Thanks to all of you for joining us. So this year, the Practices of Freedom Project, the Center for Urban Education, and the Kinloch Commons for Critical Pedagogy and Leadership join in thematic study around education and the Black Fantastic. We come to this study, of course, through centuries of a horrific, violent world order, but also through recent years of both really remarkable liberatory movements and change, as well as striking reformulations of repressive power. So we've witnessed and participated in global uprisings for racial justice, massive labor strikes connected across seemingly divergent contexts, unwavering youth movements, and we've also all experienced and observed the expected counterinsurgent response, the global escalations of state and allied citizen brutality, from the increased militarization of police and militias to live streamed, unimpeded genocide in Gaza, now moving into the West Bank, and also across multiple locations on the planet. We've seen related and compounding ecocides, and of course, the vicious academic repression in what some call the global north, brought to you really courtesy of the usual suspects, but also the sort of surfacing liberal so-called critical forces in the university that are part of that repression. So in that context, and many more that I haven't named, we're really staying steadfast to the idea that education, so the thing that we think about and work on every day, is the self-determined domain of peoples, and that its contemporary colonial occupation and weaponization is certainly vast, it's certainly brutal, but it's also fragile. So what are the ideas we can study, practice, and deepen as we continue the work of educational reclamation and return and futures? What is the Black Fantastic? Asks Ekow Eshun. The Black Fantastic, he says, is our freedom. The Black Fantastic is liberation. So we welcome you today to a year of education in the Black Fantastic, to the ongoing work of our freedom and our liberation. And who better to inaugurate that year than my dear friend, Dr. Damien Sojoyner. It was, in fact, Damien who introduced me to the ideas and the frames of the fantastic. Dr. Sojoyner is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. He researches the relationship among the public education system, prisons, and the construction of Black masculinity in Southern California. He is the author of 3 books: First Strike, Educational Enclosures in Black Los Angeles; Joy and Pain, A Story of Black Life and Liberation in 5 albums; and Against the Carceral Archive, The Art and Black Liberatory Practice. The Art of, excuse me. He's an extraordinary scholar and educator, and I could not be more excited to invite you all to join me in welcoming Damien.
Thanks, Sabina. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I can't wait to have a very productive conversation around this very important issue.
Yeah, so as we talk today, all of you on this call, we're gonna have a very wide-ranging, open conversation, and we'll have lots of time for you all to share questions. I'll remind you and let you know, but you can share the questions in two ways. One is send them in the chat to us, and we'll check it as we can, and then have a time to check it. And then also you can post them through the Q&A function, which is helpful because other people on the call can see your questions. So, Damien, by way of entering our conversation and framing the fantastic for the audience a little bit, I thought I'd read a quotation from Eshun and then one from Aiton. And then we'll get into people don't want to hear me talk, they want to hear you. So, I'll do the framing and then we'll move forward. So, Ekow Eshun has written, quote, "The Black fantastic is less a genre or a movement than a way of seeing, shared by artists who grapple with the legacy of slavery and the inequities of racialized contemporary society." He goes on to say that in its contemporary formations, the Black fantastic, quote, "proposes that we both recognize the realities of the racialized everyday, and also reach beyond its strictures, conjuring new paradigms, new visions, new possibilities with which to express the wonder and strangeness of being Black in the world." And in his extraordinary book, In Search of the Black Fantastic, Politics and Popular Culture in the Civil Rights Era, which our Practices of Freedom participants are studying this fall, Richard Aiton writes, quote, my suggestive reference to a Black fantastic then is meant to refer to the minor key sensibilities generated from the experiences of the underground, the vagabond, and those constituencies marked as deviant, notions of being that are inevitably aligned within, in conversation with, against, and articulated beyond the boundaries of the modern. So these framings give an initial sort of form and provocation to our dialogue today, sort of help us think about how do we even begin to think about the fantastic? What shape will our questions take in this year of study, and what are the possibilities? So in that vein, Damien, I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about how you got to be thinking about the fantastic, and maybe how does it figure into the Black radical tradition, um, in your own work.
Okay, well, thank you, thank you for that preface as well, in terms of having a framing of understanding, and I'm so thrilled that the programming for this year is centered around that also. So this the idea of the fantastic, in terms of how you and I have been discussing it, uh, came up recently in terms of our discussions. And that was sparked by a conversation I had with my very good friend and mentor, João Costa Vargas, who's at the University of California, Riverside. Um, and he reminded me, he and I were both at a meeting together at the Southern California Library, located in Los Angeles. And the meeting was a discussion of the archives of Clyde Woods. Clyde Woods was a phenomenal thinker, scholar, mentor, who was trained as a geographer, but sort of spanned several different fields. And in that meeting, there was a conversation that was being had about Oakland at the time. And Cedric Robinson was there at the meeting as well. And a question was posed to Cedric. Um, and Cedric also, I should mention for those who don't know, in a similar vein to Clyde, brilliant political theorist, Black studies scholar, was a dynamic mentor in his own right. And we could just have a whole conversation about Clyde and Cedric if we want to for the next hour and a half. But Cedric, his response to Oakland was that, in particular, the people of Oakland who were there were and his description of sort of like the aesthetic of the city was in the context of the fantastic. Now, Cedric didn't write much at all about the fantastic, but when Jerome and I were speaking about what sort of was meant about that, and it both resonated with us in a very profound way. And the idea, the sort of the notion of the fantastic then begins to sort of take root and take form within this context of a somewhat of a very what can be read as an over deterministic framing of what Black life is. And that framing oftentimes is situated either in a sort of top-down model of in terms of like what are the political um uh um uh dimensions that are needed for Black life, and those political dimensions oftentimes are not they're out of the hands of Black people. They're out of the hands of Black communities. And so in that way, they're already sort of mapped out in terms of what they're going to be, but supposedly they have the best interests of Black people in mind, because in this way, Black people don't know how to determine their own future. The sort of the second way also of looking at that is that much of the solution base in regards to how to sort of make Black life better, or however you want to frame it, is also driven in a sort of a prototypical nationalist formation with where the ethos is very much undergirded by a particular type of economic sensibility. And with that understanding in play, then what we have to do and what we have to understand is that the ways in which Blackness is situated is outside of the sort of framing of civic life as we know it. And as such, then we have to begin to expand our knowledge base beyond those structures, and then grapple with, well, what are outside of those boundaries? And in that way, then to understand Blackness and Black life, Black sociality as existing outside of those boundaries gives us sort of pathways then to understand that there are a multiplicity of sort of quote unquote solutions that then makes sense in multiple ways. And these solutions oftentimes are right in front of our face, but because we're sort of trained from an early age, and education is part of this training, we're sort of trained in the early age at an early age to understand that those pathways are dangerous, that those pathways are illogical, that those pathways don't make sort of like sense for the betterment of quote unquote society. uh, we begin to sort of put blinders on to those pathways, right? So this understanding then of fantastic is actually is to dive into those pathways and begin to really sort of center them as the foundation for then moving forward with coming up with strategies. And very often the you can anticipate what the pushback is going to be to a certain degree, but then also you have to realize that the framing in this way of the fantastic of with regards to Blackness then is going to be at such that the ways in which the state operates is going to be a sort of knee-jerk response that then unsettles the state. And as such, you have to constantly both um, be on guard to a certain extent, but then also realize that these solutions will keep on working as long as you are beholden to them. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be seem like you're sort of going against what is normative, but to stay in that groove, to stay in that lane, and then to sort of see the beauty that comes about as a result.
And I wonder if for people who are listening and who are, new to the fantastic, maybe also new to thinking about the Black radical tradition. If you could make some simple connections before we move to LA.
Sure. So, I would say first, for those who are interested in the Black radical tradition, as a sort of concept and theme, I would say that there's not one particular like way of quote unquote doing it, right? And I'm gonna be real careful right now because this term Black radical tradition has been highly contested, which is unfortunate. And oftentimes, Cedric Robinson's name gets thrown in to these conversation in ways that he never wanted them to be in the first place, at all, right? That being said, um, one of the texts that I think is important, at least for me, in terms of grounding the understanding of the Black radical tradition is Black Marxism and a laying out of a particular set of praxis that understands the ways in which expressions of Black radicalism are in fact separate from Western normative um, uh, constructions of politics, society, and being. And in that way, then we can understand that there are um, modalities of life which are very important uh, and are key for both Black survival, which are central then to begin to theorizing on one hand about, but then also to centering with regards to, okay, how do we come up with um, a different way of doing this thing, right? And doing this thing could be something as quote unquote simple as understanding what are the limitations of K through 12 education in the United States. Well, a way that the sort of Black ra radicalism would look at that is say that you have to begin to break out of the boundaries of the sort of nation state
Mhm.
formation and understand that the intent and function of education has never truly been about what is sort of put out there, which is like to uplift the masses and to have everybody do better. But when you begin to see who are to borrow from the phrase of William Watkins, who are the architects of education in the United States, um, throughout South America and West Africa, South Africa, North Africa, even throughout Europe as well. There's a particular ideology that's at play that is attempting to form a particular type of subject. And that's subject making then becomes much more important for those who have and continue to design the structure of education than actual the idea of like learning. Now, when you then sort of read the archives of these architects, when you read the archives, the transcripts side by side with um, Black leaders, when I say leaders, I mean in terms of like charismatic figures who have left archives, so like the written documents behind, of course, and I use that in air quotes because we have to understand that the archives are limiting in that way, because there's so much that was not sort of mapped out, and we could talk later about speculating in terms of what that can bring, but when you read that side by side, you see that there is a completely different formation of education that is not just being proposed, but put into action on the part of Black people throughout all of these areas in the world that has nothing to do with the sort of at a very basic level, the political economy interest of these architects that in many instances connects notions of labor and freedom to education,
Mhm.
it disabuses all of that altogether. And that shouldn't come as a surprise because in many instances, you have many Black people who were in the constraints of forced labor roles. The last thing that's on their mind is the idea of work being tied to anything at all, right? It's more of getting back to a particular type of sensibility that creates true autonomy and modalities of freedom that are expressed and outside of the severe l limitations of labor or work as we know it.
Which is really a perfect segue into thinking about, I mean, your life and your work, and I use the word work in a big, with all its capacity, its capaciousness, but your life and work are in LA. And I wonder if we can shift to thinking about then the fantastic, and LA as sort of uh, an exciting example.
Sure, yeah. So there is for many people probably know of the hip hop artist Nipsey Hussle, for example, right? So that's um just outside of him as a hip hop artist. If we take the life of Nipsey Hussle and that sort of what he was doing in LA as a sort of a model to then understand of just the expansiveness of what the fantastic can be, then we can begin to understand um uh how this centering of a particular type of knowledge formation is critical in that way. So if Caitlin, if you could play that interview with Nipsey Hussle, and I should mention for those who are watching, this is an interview of a very young Nipsey Hussle. I believe he's 21 years old at the time.
I mean, I feel like, we got a common enemy, you know what I'm saying? So I don't feel we got time to be beefing. You know what I'm saying? It don't make no sense. That's divide and conquer, you know what I'm saying? That's Willie Lynch. You know what I mean? We got a common enemy in these capitalists that's taking control of our assets and colonizing what we doing. As far as rap music, as far as our continent we came from, our culture and all that, like, we got a common enemy. So we ain't got time to have issues amongst ourselves.
And I should mention a little background about Nipsey is that he's from LA. He's a member of a organization called the Rolling 60s. He drops out of high school at the age of 16, but becomes heavily politicized both through the sort of his life within the Rolling 60s and then also his travels abroad as well. So he spent a lot of time in East Africa as well. And so he has this multi faceted perspective on sort of the possibilities of both a life to be, but he also has a keen sense of, all right, these are sort of like the challenges that are ahead, and this is what's being faced. Never does he ever lose sight, however, that centering of that knowledge must come from within um, the community in which he's raised. And so there's we can see this very clearly because Nipsey more or less is a child of the 1992 re rebellion in LA. And in that, he very much understands the power of Black organizations to then keep out formations of violence from within their neighborhoods, as was done in 92, and in a similar fashion was done in 1965 with the Watts Rebellion as well. And so one of his most popular songs that he has called Hustle and Motivate, um, while the lyrics are saying one thing, the video is a particular formation of I iconography that harkens back to 92 and 65. And in this manner, he's very much sort of um, playing off of the uh, uh, symbolism that was put forward by the Panthers in LA, for example. So this is something that Bunchy Carter would do all the time. He would the Panthers would throw a party. He would invite members of the Slaussons, the businessmen, all of these organizations that were there. There would be music playing. He would stop the music and then get up on the stage and be like, "All right, y'all, come to this meeting on Saturday at 9 a.m." Right, and then the line would be there on that Saturday. So it's this idea of knowing that this is sort of the things that since he's tapped into what it is that drives Black community and culture, he then also understands that it's not just one thing all the time. So anyway, I still like to say as a preface for the video. So if you could play that video of that song, please, Kayla.
Pull up in motorcades. I got a show today. It's all I'm trying to do. Hustle and motivate. Choppers a throwaway. Hustle the overweight. That's why they follow me, huh? They think I know the way. Cause I took control of things. Ballin' the solo way. And if you pattern my trend, I make you my protege. Slauson that soldier race. Niggas don't know them days. Take you in back of the buildings. Make you expose your rage. Take you across the tracks. Make you explode the face. Now you official now. But you got a soul to save. I just been cooking that new. I'm about to drop in a few. Think if I call it the great, the people gon' call it the truth. I ain't really trip on the credit. I just paid all of my dues. I just respected the game. Now my name all in the news. Tripping on all of my moves. Quote me on this, got a lot more to prove. Remember I came in this bitch, fresh out the county with nothing to lose.
No, on the ground, yeah. But I don't do this shit for nothing. No, not at all. Yeah, but my money real, that you do. Oh yeah, so I don't do this shit for nothing.
All right, and so I think that that video in particular, in context of the interview as well, is very important because we have to understand that this type of knowledge formation that Nipsey is getting is not taught in school, right? So when we're talking about the language he's using of colonizers and capitalists and who the occupying forces are, it's understood that this is not just rhetoric. He's seeing very much directly that there's a role and a function of the police within his own neighborhood in much the same way that there was a role and function of British and French and Spanish settlers all throughout what we now call the Americas, all throughout Africa as well. And so you then have to begin to dig deep and figure out, okay, well, how does this come about, right? So how does one begin to get this knowledge that's not being procured within the process of the civic, right? So it's not coming from any structures that it's state sanctioned at all. And that's the part where the Black fantastic becomes very important. However, I also want to mention that there is not just, I should say, reiterate that there is not just this one path that one takes, right? And so oftentimes Nipsey gets categorized as being a particular type of like music, a particular like the music that he made gets sort of fashioned in this way, but you have to understand that it's coming out of a context in which there's a multiplicity of expressions, and that he is both a product of that, and also is manifesting it as well. So just about 7 or 8 blocks up from where Nipsey's neighborhood is the neighborhood of Leimert Park. And in that is in that area is a just a I mean I'm thinking of the words. I'm sort of getting lost in words because of the production of blackness that has come out of that area is just it's crazy. I mean, just to think about, you have so many types of artists, uh, painters, musicians, dancers that sort of span the spectrum of that. And um, when you then put that in context with what Nipsey is coming from, then you begin to understand that there's a lot that's going on here, right? So, as an example, there's a group called Haiku d'Etat, which was initially formed. There was a cafe called the Good Life Cafe, that was first established as sort of like a hub for artists to come and learn their craft. And we have to also think about this is during the context where uh, music, fine arts, all this is being stripped out of schools. And it's being stripped out of schools in direct response to what was happening after 1965, and also completely pared down after 1992 as well, because Black Power organizations understood the power of Black culture to sort of transform the over deterministic nature of the political realm, which we spoke about earlier. And so, in that way, that there became a milieu in which Black communities became even more important, to sort of as hubs in that way. So, if you could play that clip from Haiku d'Etat, that would be great.
Haiku d'Etat, Haiku d'Etat. Written in 5, 7, 5, 3 lines that don't rhyme. Written in 5, 7, 5, 3 lines that don't rhyme. Haiku d'Etat. Underground, mainstream, grassroots of a movement grow. Ocean floor to sky, from the island to the Hollywood capital. Real MCs don't die, though the flesh is weak and bones just wither away. Music will survive, like a tree standing, planted right by the water, flourish in sunlight. Haiku d'Etat, Haiku d'Etat. Written in 5, 7, 5, 3 lines that don't rhyme. Written in 5, 7, 5, 3 lines that don't rhyme. Haiku d'Etat. Floating leaves hover.
All right, so it's so just to sort of paint a picture of what's going on here. The Good Life Cafe moves to another location once it closes down, called Chaos Network, and Network is under the directorship of Ben Caldwell. And by the way, there's a fantastic book by a good friend Tosh Frazier in Ben called Chaos Theory, for those who are interested in it, because it delves into all of the sort of brilliance that comes from out of chaos. And right next to Chaos Network is the World Stage, which is one of the sort of the hubs of jazz in LA. And just next to there is Debbie Allen has a dance theater as well. So I say a lot to say is that you have all of these sort of hubs of Black art that are all next to each other, and Nipsey and Haku D'etat, which is a formation of several different sort of both solo artists and groups that came together, are all in conversation with what's going on in um, this community, which is nothing that is at all being sanctioned by the state. Like this is all existing outside of the boundaries of sort of like the official state. This is Black people who are coming together um, and supporting one another in a way that runs counter to what the state wants. And to that point, you can once again, if you think this is sort of hyperbolic, all you have to do then is go back and look at the sort of state archives of the LAPD records, of the FBI records, and they show that they are surveilling all of these people all the time, right? This is because oftentimes you say such things and people think like you're just being putting extras on it, so to speak. The state doesn't really know what to do with it, and they're very much afraid because of what happened in '92 of another sort of explosive event. And so in that way, the formations of control that they use are very much in line with fascist thinking, right? So you just like the hubs that that are happening, as an example, schools in this case, because both 92 and 65 were heavily influenced by the organizing that was happening out of Dorsey High School, Crenshaw High School, Fremont High School as well. You begin to severely enclose the possibility of that formation at all. And so um, as that's going on, then I think it becomes imperative for us to then invest our attention in theorizing in this sort of like this other, so to speak, right? But that other, in fact, has a life of its own that we have to understand doesn't need to any type of explanation, but it needs for us to then understand how to sort of delve into that as the only possibility of getting out of this mess.
I mean, it strikes me what you said about the state doesn't know what to do with that. And I think one of the things the state and its allied citizenries do is the sort of ideological bait and switch, right? So that any Black liberation movement, any Black cultural movement, any Black anything is a reaction to, right? It's always a response to, and that's the sort of effort to flip reality so that they recenter and recenter and recenter and reformulate themselves or itself as the state. And what strikes me is what you said about the state doesn't know what to do, and that seemed to be part of the visual narrative in the Nipsey Hussle music video, right? Because there's that, and this sort of seems to go back to Iton too, that there's the everyday sort of, it's not disregarding the everyday of police violence, but also reimagining, reformulating, creating a new normal, new possibility, but drawn from something that well precedes the mess, this like contemporary, and re-articulating it in a way that the representation of the state there doesn't know what to do, right? He moves as police are moving, and then all of a sudden doesn't know what to do. And I wonder if that's a place. I think also people don't know about you, or some people do, but some people on the call might not know about you. And you didn't know I was going to talk about this, but Damien's musically brilliant. So I'm struck too by the connection with Eiton's framework of the minor key, and sort of how you're seeing, maybe even in some like detail, these elements. And even though the Black fantastic or the fantastic sort of deliberately defies definition, and that's an important um, part of the practice and the being, are there like ways that people can see these sort of musical or visual or aesthetic specificities as illustrating these dimensions of the fantastic?
Yeah, so I think, in that way, and I thank you for saying that I'm musically brilliant.
You
I think
are.
many people would not agree with that sentiment, but um
Well, if they're here, they can sign off.
um I so yes, so I think there's definitely um very much ways in which that register of the minor key is very much important for understanding like what Black life is. And in particular, I think if you think about just jazz, for example, right, which is the part of the brilliance of jazz, of course, is this incorporation of a particular set of minor chords which have been sort of flipped on their heads, and then it sort of takes music into a whole nother way. But um I think the key aspect of jazz, which people, when I say people, a lot of jazz critics in the 1940s and 50s didn't understand, was that uh the jazz artists who we now think of as being sort of like the standard bearers of jazz, like the Charlie Parkers and the Miles Davis and Wayne Shorters, um, they had a mastery of Western music that was sort of backwards and forwards. And it was only after that mastery then could they then develop something completely different and new and completely change it on its head. And part of that is in alignment with aspects of the Black radical tradition as well, which is that when you think of sort of like key figures who are sort of become icons or of liberation practices, you have to understand that many of these people spent decades of their lives first operating and working within the context of Western sort of politics, so to be, right? And then sort of bump their head like the 115th time and realize like, okay, this is not working. It needs something vastly different. And because they had a mastery of what it was already that they were working against, the then turn into Blackness as a way to counter it becomes very much easy. And of course, then the state doesn't understand what to do with it because the in much the same way as jazz, the articulation of what it is then becomes heretic. And I say that word because that is very much what jazz critics in the 1940s and 50s were calling these artists, right? They were like, they don't know what they're doing, they're fumbling around, blah, 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 blah. All right. So then you fast forward then to 1990s and 2000s, and then all of a sudden jazz has become the standard bearer of American culture. So much so that there's a whole docu-series on jazz being like the music of America, right? Whatever the hell that means, right? But there's a particular type of co-optation which then attempts to shave off all of the elements of the fantastic from jazz and then make it into this liberal type of project. And uh, I think what's important for us then is to clasp onto the totality of those minor chords then to understand what it is that's being expressed. Because once sort of like the state moves around and begins to get its hands on the thing, it's going to try to shave off all of the radical possibility that is expressed, right? And so in the formation of education, you can perhaps see this most clearly in terms of how um, uh, how should I say, like how the formation of the United States is taught throughout schools in the US, right? And it's astounding to me that if you look at the same time period that we're talking about, um, all of these presidents, right? We're talking about from George Washington, Jefferson, all these people. And if you take them outside of their parochial stance of the United States and then put them into the context of other quote unquote leaders who we are not shy at all are saying as dictators, right? In other countries, then these people look completely different, right? And that's the expression that Black radicalism articulates, and that articulation becomes very much important to then understand in terms of elements of the fantastic itself. So, in a very concrete way, when we're thinking about uh, post Reconstruction in the U.S., right? We're talking about a time and a possibility that was wide open and expansive for things to happen, right? Well, how did this happen? And this is very much important for thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction United States, which sets the tone for a different type of formation of moving forward. And in that way, when you look at what was being articulated by Black thinkers from the early 1800s all the way through that century, what education and freedom was completely different than what was given to us. However, once education becomes co-opted by Northern industrialists and that sort of insidious pact that was made with the Southern plantation bloc, it begins to trim away all of that because that was going to be completely disruptive, not to just to the formation of the quote unquote US, but then it becomes disruptive to global capital as we know it, right, as a whole. And this just was not just happening in the United States, right? This is happening all throughout South America, Central America, and Africa as well, right? And so in that way, then I'm sorry, I've delved way beyond what your question was about the minor key, but I promise I will bring it back. Um, which is that the relationality of that particular type of mastery and understanding is very, very critical, right? It's imperative. And I say that as such that we have to understand that the artists that we were just talking about, whether it be Haiku d'etat or Nipsey Hussle or jazz artists or dancers, in this way, they have both mastered their craft to such an extent that it now expands beyond those boundaries, and it's the creation of something that cannot be put into the box, right? And that is the expression of Blackness itself. And so rather than try to put it into this box, let's let the box just completely die, and then let's live in that world. That becomes very unsettling then for many people because that breaks down the idea of what a structure is in the first place, right? In terms of what the role of governance as we know it is. That completely unsettles it altogether, right? Now, I would say that while that sounds crazy to you and I, maybe, right, and to people listening, let me tell you, that is how the top 1% lives their lives every day of the week. There are no boxes, there are no boundaries. They just do what in the hell they want to do, right? And that is how people rule the world, so to speak. All right, now I'm come back to the minor key, and I'm gonna be quiet because I'm going on way too many tangents once again. Um, I think it becomes then very important for us as thinkers, as scholars, as practitioners, as members of communities, to invest ourselves into that knowledge formation that is critical to the reduction of those minor keys. And if we do that, then we'll be on a path both that we don't know where it's going to go, right? But on a path that will be highly generative.
So there are two connections that I want to make from what you said to other conversations we've had. And I'm going to ask you to connect to David Walker's appeal. See if I can do it. I think one of the things you're pointing to is this, what I'm better understanding through our conversation actually is, both Eshun and Ito talk about kind of recognizing the everyday of colonial anti-Black violence. But it's not phrased as referential. And sort of what you're describing is, I think, a move apart or aside or outside of, as you said, get rid of the box from other ways in which many of us have kind of struggled to think through um, the end of this sort of current world order. And so I think about the struggles in turn of the 21st century around post-colonial theories. So what does the post mean? And then there's the D and the anti, and the kind of, I think, really meaningful substantive struggles, but trying to get away from being referential, always recentering the colonial, right? So one of the things I think Black radicalism does, and I'm hearing a sort of the aesthetic and the ontologic and epistemic in the fantastic is doing that. So it's not just that there's the ability. I mean, I go back to the Nipsey Hussle video, which I saw differently this time, which was really cool. So the not sort of pretending we can ignore the reality of the everyday, but not being referential to the everyday. And I think that's the rupture, or maybe the minor key that I'm understanding in the fantastic. And I think that leads us to, and I think that the video assists in this segue, which is that I think part of the sort of reformist efforts, the sort of liberal efforts, even maybe efforts that people feel are transformative around schooling in particular, really defang the history of schooling, really sort of remove it or abstract it from its materially violent history and present, right? So that even the sort of discussions around Black Reconstruction, it's a long book, so I get if people miss parts of it, but there's discussion of violence, right, around education. So I was really struck when I listened to you talk about David Walker's appeal and sort of the connections between the fantastic and the importance of understanding the originary and ongoing violence around contestations over self-determination and education. And I wonder if you can connect, maybe share the David Walker appeal quotation that you've read before, and maybe think with us about how that's connected to the possibilities in the fantastic.
Sure. And so I won't read that whole quote because it's kind of long and I've talked
Okay.
way too much at this point. But what Walker, I mean, just as a paraphrase of that quote, and this is in Dave Walker's appeal, right, which is written in 1827. There's another one, 1829, and then he's poisoned and killed, and as a result of articulating that there's a particular formation of liberation that exists outside of this colonial apparatus. And in that, in his appeal, um, he speaks about education at length. And in particular, he says that the reason why the owners of plantations don't want Black people to be educated is that if they sort of truly knew who these people were, then it would be all bad for them, right? Like you would have a violent rupture in the entire system. And he's right about this, right? Like he's right about it because prior to that, there are revolts and ruptures all throughout Central America, South America, right? Wherever there's a colonial apparatus and wherever you have Black people who are passing down um, formations of knowledge to each other, ruptures exist all over the place. And that happened after he passed away as well, right? There's countless revolts that are taking place. Gerald Horne writes about this at length and talks about that much of the U.S. South is constantly on fire all throughout the 1800s. And what we have to understand is that the formation of education, in particular in this country, was used to try to contain those revolts because there has to be a way for global capital then to move forward. It can't move forward if everything is being burned down all the time, right? And so, just as a quick link, then, if we think about what Nipsey Hussle in particular, that interview, think about the fact that he dropped out of school, right? That's in the context of during that time period, there was roughly a 40% withdrawal rate of Black students from schools in LAUSD. This is exactly the same things happened in 1965 in LA. There are whole units that are being put up in place that are established in 1960s in an effort to try to uh, figure out what in the heck is going on and why are all these Black youth withdrawing from school. Well, it's quite logical if you listen to what Nipsey's saying, right? Like there's what I'm being taught here has nothing to actually, A, has nothing to do with what my life is, but importantly, B, is actually trying to decenter Blackness from the equation altogether. So then if we look at what Nipsey is articulating both in his words, but in the music videos, then we see that link that's going on from David Walker, Nipsey Hussle. I mean, it's countless people then who are tying together to understand like, okay, there's something else that's happening here. But importantly, in discussing education, we have to see the limitations of education as a space for this to actually um, take place at all because it was never set up in that way. It could not hold, right? The center cannot hold that at all. That is the box which needs to be exploded as all.
Okay, so I'm thinking at this point, do you want to talk about the sort of crossroads in contemporary education, or do you want to move in a different direction?
Well, I'm looking at the time, and so I
Yeah.
want to be cognizant of that. So maybe you want to open it up for,
You want to do that now?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And we have a couple questions here. So one is, how might there be a Black fantastic living syllabus to co-create the conditions for liberation? And then another is, in a parsimonious fashion, please provide an illustration of how the Black fantastic angle of vision contributes to a specific closing of the opportunity gap. And share more questions, please, you all. You can drop them in the Q&A or you can chat us directly if you prefer.
So okay, so I think for the first question, which I think is a fantastic question, this I think is fairly simple to do, in particular within the age of social media, so to speak, which is that um, there's ways in which you can create um, uh, syllabi which take into account all of the expansiveness of sort of the fantastic, right? And so you can incorporate formations of music, you can create formations of art, but importantly, you can do this in a way that takes into account of regions and why regions are very important. Because what works in LA is not going to work in Pittsburgh. It's not going to work in Florida. It's not going to work in New York. And so that connection is very important to then map out to see like, okay, well, this is happening here because the people who are going to be the sort of most savvy to understand what's going on are the artists themselves because they have this goes back to the idea the of being able to master something. They have a firm grasp of both the limitations of the state, but then also are deeply immersed in uh, formations of the fantastic that are very much sort of missing, as we would say, from the political sort of civic process.
And then I don't know if you want to think about that illustration of how the Black fantastic angle of vision might contribute to a specific closing of the opportunity gap.
So yeah, so I think that actually the Black fantastic that is idea of the Black fantastic, right? That particular angle would expand beyond that sort of notion of, for example, the opportunity gap, right? So anything with the idea of like a gap, and whether that be like the achievement gap or the opportunity gap. And I understand the spirit of the question, right? Which is in terms of looking for a way to understand how to break down the inequities that take place in school. And part of what you and I have been discussing is the fact that this, in fact, is what schools are meant to do in the first place, that they are doing their function. And so part of part and parcel is that the fantastic thing would say, well, you have to then begin to think outside of the limitations presented by this idea of schooling itself. And in that way, you then understand that sort of like these theories that come out of universities are meant to re-ensconce the civic. So what I mean by that is the achievement gap, the opportunity gap are really formations that are put in place to then put Black people back into the civic project. How can we then begin to incorporate Black people into that civic project? But of course, there are even limitations within that process, right? Because that's going to be one in which it is understood that Blackness still, this is within even a liberal framework, right? In order for this to operate, Blackness still has to be on the bottom hierarchy, right? Because you can't destabilize liberalism in order for it to work, right? So there's that, right? But even more so, in thinking about the fantastic, this sort of rupture of those theories and of those ideologies then works to place um, new sort of understandings of life. And when we have these new understandings of life, then you can see clear as day as to why these ideas and thinkings are just going to both re-ensconce Blackness into a trope that's going to be not helpful actually for Black people.
And yet there's a challenge because as we sort of finished up our conversation talking about the violent, like fundamentally violent center and origin of education and ongoing practice, there is a such an attachment, as you said, in liberalism to the idea that schooling is good and redeemable. And we just have to, figure out equity and figure out inclusion. And it's such a challenging conversation, I think, for people who are in the field who maybe have an insight or a critique or an observation or a practice that it even gets shamed. There's sort of like a practical, pedagogical, theoretical shaming for people, right? So I think there's a real tension around getting us past that um the period of time where people feel entrapped by that.
Yeah, I agree. As a whole, and I think it's in part because it's sort of like the natures of schools of education themselves, right? Which is to produce a particular type of thinking in a particular type of way that is going to make the society look normative again and again.
Yeah.
And in many ways, schools of education are some of the most conservative places on universities, not so much because that the people there are conservative or sort of backward thinking, but you have to think of what the function of education is, right? Man, education is not meant to do something that's going to disrupt the social way of being as we know it.
Right. Well, and I think in spite of what happens in schools of education, if your anchor is a state-aligned teacher preparation program, right? If that's the center, then that's the West Point of colonial ideology making, right? That's training cadres of people to go in and do the state's ideological work, to be boots on the ground. And so as long as that's the core, th- yes, schools of education are rough.
Yeah. So I mean, and I don't want to limit it to schools of education, but I know in the
Yeah,
context of what we're thinking, but we think about universities as a whole.
yeah,
And so, I'm in the department of anthropology, and anthropology is littered with this, like all over. Like they literally lay down the blueprint of how to make colonialism real,
yeah.
not just in the past, but even today. Like
Yeah.
there are anthropologists in the context of if you think about abolition, there are anthropologists who actually put cops into motion.
Yeah.
They design programs and structures.
Mhm.
They even think about like hotspots, and you think about predictive policing. This is all developed by
Mhm.
anthropologists who then sort of send the cops into motion to surveil, harass, and kill Black people, right? So like this is all linked together. It's nothing in that sort of abstract. So
Mhm.
once you then begin to understand that there's very much a material and ideological
Mhm.
reward for doing this coming out that, by the state, because it's coming from a state structure, of course, but it's being articulated. Education is one of the primary structures of the state. Then you have to begin to say, okay, well, what is outside of this? Because this is not going to work.
Right. And it's massive. It's more massive than all branches of the military, executive, and judicial branches combined.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
an enormous repressive ideological apparatus. So it's pretty extraordinary. And it's so normalized. I think that's, another thing that we've been thinking about in getting excited about studying the fantastic is there actually is another normal, right? There's a Black normal, and that's the fantastic. And then there's the sort of normalization that's an act of ongoing terror and control. And schooling is part of that normalization, right? That's that school's a good thing and it's the part of a democratic process. So I'm gonna stop talking though because Kip had the question. So for those of us working to remake the educational opportunities children in our communities and country and world have access to in a situation in which the state is more and more cracking down on such opportunities, where do you think we should start? Of course, we need to keep being educated ourselves. And Kip, you're the best. You're always at everything, the most self-educated person. So I appreciate this. And this hour has been an immense shove in that direction. But do you see emerging any national focus with calls to action that we could join in with? Thank you both.
So I would say to that, and maybe Sabina, you could speak more to that because I think a lot of the
Mhm.
programming that you've been doing for the past year aligns very much with that. But for for me, I would say this just as maybe take one step back. I think the national focus is important, but for my particular vantage point, the a local slash regional focus is even more important. And the reason why I say that is that so so much of what happens in these regions becomes fodder and is modeled to then expand throughout the nation. And just as an anecdote of that, when we think about education, for example, like the DARE program, to dare to keep kids off of drugs, that gets modeled in LA and then expanded outwards. So then once you begin to talk with organizations who have worked and understood the limitations of that, then you see like, okay, this is a way forward. This is a way how we can understand what's going on, right? The second thing about sort of once again, I think the national conversation is important. But once you get to that national level, what takes place then is, oh, well, we can't talk about that because we have to be able to make sure that we're keeping in mind this group or that group or this group, right? And then begin to just cut away and trim and leave off. And part of what you and I have been talking about is that no, 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 you need to incorporate all of that into what's going on. So I'll step away from that because I know that there's organizations in LA, but many people are not in LA. So it's no point in naming those organizations per se. Um, but I think all I'll say to that question is start at the local level and then expand out.
And maybe the only thing I'll add, because yes, I think start locally, but I think in the spirit of the conversation we've been having, that local start is people's education, right? Rather than locally, as in Pittsburgh Public Schools. And I think we can get confused that state organization is a community or a group of people, but it's artificial, right? It's there, has huge material implications, and it's artificial. And so I think I think in the spirit of what we've been talking about, to understand and study the national, but not to contribute. So the US is a made up thing. The US is a fiction. It's fake. And I'm not going to speak for Damien. I hope it ends soon. I hope this fiction, this nightmare fiction, comes to an end soon. So if we are wanting to maintain the nation, then that would be a place to put energy. I think it's a place to study and be vigilant. But I think what is the plan is the self-determination of peoples, and peoples are very local. That means that even that term peoples means something different in different locations. And so it's the local and it's the connection among locals. I do think that's super important, that if we're building a different kind of fantastic future, then the locals have to be connected and understand one another in their sovereign, autonomous, self-determined educational work, so that it's not a set of isolated groups, which then just get re-oppressed and absorbed very quickly in a new nation state formation. So the goal for me is to not have a nation state and to not have a state controlling people through this some sort of compulsory ideological apparatus. Okay, Martez, can Damien say more about the power of rupture, uprising, and revolt within the framework of the Black Fantastic? I contend that the creative and cultural genius of Black people must necessarily encompass concepts of sabotage and the redistribution of pain.
Yes. So I think one of the key elements within the Black Fantastic is that oftentimes the idea of revolt is understood as spontaneous. That's the way it gets framed within the Western context. And once you begin to delve into Black culture and Blackness, you understand that none of this is spontaneous. It is well planned out, it is highly orchestrated, and it's thought through. And in that way, I will harken back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that there's a mastery of the system. So there is an understanding of what are quote unquote targets, what can be hit, what can't be hit. There's an understanding of what needs to be organized further. There's an understanding of what areas need to be reckoned with, right? And I always my reference point in terms of the context of this conversation is both 65 and 92 in LA, both which get articulated as being sort of spontaneous explosions in the city. But then you begin to sort of do the work of talking to people who sort of both lived through it, but also who planned it and realized that none of this was spontaneous. That's A. But then B, in terms of the redistribution of pain, there was an understanding of like what are the parts of the city that are very precious to sort of like elements of the civic. A lot of this has to do with labor and work. And once you remove those parts, it really puts a heavy hand um, on the powers of the on the scale, so to speak, and then the leverage is swung into your favor in a dramatic way. Now, the issue, however, oftentimes that comes about is that the sort of what needs to be done is like the propaganda work on sort of our side, so to speak, which is to understand that in these moments, then this is logical, right? This sort of expression of revolt is not something that is out of like a reaction, but in fact is something that is well planned out. And given that that's the case, then we should be in line with it. So as a point, and this is something that I have stated over and over again, is that what would take place is if instead, because many organizations have a funding apparatus that supports sort of ending dropouts. Well, what if you had organizations instead that supported withdrawals from school? This is a point of leverage then that allows communities to have a much bigger say and power because it puts it hits on several pressure points that then um, make the state and those fissures that align with it very vulnerable. And in that context, it forces the state then to show its hand, right? To sort of make it plain what it is. And we can see, for example, that being done all throughout Gaza right now, right? It's the very first places that were hit were universities in Palestine. Why is that the case? What's going on, right? Well, there's an exposure then of the plan in Israel in terms of what's at stake. And they just lay their hand out, like pretty much very bare as to what it is that they're doing. Now they can use all of the tropes like we're doing this, we're doing that for this reason, or this person was there, right? But it's laid out plain, plain as day. And in those moments, this was where Black radicalism comes to the fore, is that once you see that it's not just a project that happens in this country or that country, that is linked together, and that this sort of mapping out of a colonial apparatus is at play, and how you play that out then regionally begins to connect with these international formations, the propaganda work for, and I'm using propaganda as a neutral word in this context, um, becomes very much easy for us to tap into and then make plain for everybody to see.
I think this segues perfectly into Cynthia's question. Can you help us to understand the connections or disconnections between the work on abolition and education and the work on the Black Fantastic?
Yeah, so I've for me, and we could have once again another 2-hour conversation on abolition within education and abolition within sort of like prisons, so to speak, right? Um, which is, I think there's been a lot of work that's been done by prison abolitionists to map out the state in very concrete ways so that prison abolition, and this is why I'm saying regions matter. I'm sorry if I'm coming back to that, right? But prison abolitionists very much understand that the development of prisons in the state of California is much different than the development of prisons in the state of New York. So therefore, when you're mapping out a plan to dismantle prisons, you have to work through all of those differences, so to speak, right? And in that way, I think that has become the limitation of abolition and education, and something that people who are truly interested in creating this sort of abolitionist movement within education could borrow from the prison abolition movement as a whole, which is a sort of a rigorous study and undertaking of the political economy, of the social formations, of these intimate relationships amongst land holding bodies and formations of schools that take place in different places to then come up with just a map of how education works, but then importantly, to understand how the relationality of peoples within different regions is very important to map out. So just as a context, right? When we think about the state of California, what was done in many instances by organizations such as Critical Resistance, and there's another broad organization called CURB, which was to understand that, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes about this brilliantly in Golden Gulag, which is that the connections amongst Black people and migrant workers who were coming to the regions of Central Valley part of California where these prisons were being built were very much tied together. Once you link Black people who are in primarily LA and Alameda County and who are being forced into these prisons that are being built all throughout the Central Valley region of the state. Once you understand these links, then you then can organize people and have them work to then fight against sort of the making of prisons, right? That's a much different terrain than what happens in Texas. So you can't use that same model. It doesn't work the same way at all. It's a much different terrain than what happens in Florida as well, and what happens in New York. And so that in particular is very important, I think, to note.
Five minutes left here and a few questions I'm going to try to combine. Kyle says, thank you for the fantastic conversation. I'm wondering how the Black Fantastic helps us think about how to engage with state education systems. And Felicia asks a similar question, sort of how do we think about the Black Fantastic as a way to disrupt the education system to include cultural pieces that are blatantly missing for education to be more meaningful for Black children. And Felicia, if I got it, if I messed it up, you can chat me. And And Kyle's wondering if you have specific examples of how collectives working within the Black Fantastic are strategically withdrawing from or partnering in some way with education at any level.
Okay, so I'll try to answer. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into the detail that's needed for both these questions because I think both these questions are great. So I apologize ahead of time for that. So I'll start with the last question first, and I think, very simply is to identify those organizations which are sort of central to the knowledge production process of Blackness within whichever city, area, community that you are in, right? So, for example, I'll take the world stage, right? So the world stage here in LA, as I mentioned before, is sort of like one of the central center jazz hubs of the region. Um, and they for a while, like they functioned to where Black youth could come in and sort of master their craft, so to speak, in a way that was impossible to be done because of what we had mentioned before. All the music programs began to get closed down. Um, and the that sort of context, it's not just music as understanding like when I say master the craft, it's not simply mastering jazz, right? But it's mastering the aesthetic of Blackness that coincides with that as well, right? So you're talking about the sensibilities of Blackness that include the Nation of Islam, that include people who are spouting ways to eat healthy, that includes sort of moving back to Africa as well. Like all these are possibilities that exist within this framework, which you're not gonna find any of this in terms of within the education system, right? All different ways of gender expression, different ways of sexual expression as well, that it's just impossible to find because that's not what uh, the sort of structure of education is set up to do. So given that that's the case, then um, we then have to identify those locations and understand that needs to be made the center, and the theorizing that we then have in terms of moving forward needs to be placed there and then mapped out further. And I think for the first question, um, I think there has to, be I'm a sort of tread lightly with this because I think there's been an uh over um saturation of sort of like mental health language that's begin to dominate like how we move forward type of thing. But I think that question points out to a very important aspect, which is that if there's a way to normalize trauma as being a centerpiece of the Black experience in school and starting from that point, as opposed to looking at trauma as something that is a random possibility that could happen at school, then you come to a completely different um, set of guidelines to then understand how all of this works. Because it's been my experience, this is just me as like a parent now, right? It's been my experience that all of our friends, all of our family understand that these schools are horrible for Black children, and we're all trying to figure out how to navigate around that. That's the sort of point of jumping off. All right, cool. Which one of these crazy places can we try to send to that maybe has a cool principal or a cool teacher? But that's not a solution at all, right? That's just working around a problem. I think importantly, and I'll stop here. I think importantly, it's important to note that there are alternatives to these schools as well that has to be mentioned, that there are Black independent schools which work against that process as well. And you and I have talked about that there's a wonderful book by Russell Rickford, which lays out the history of these schools. Also, so yeah, so I'll stop there.
We have other questions, and I apologize that we won't be able to get to yours, but please come back for future programming. And I know we're going to have to create a bibliography and put it on our websites because there are questions about books. And the Russell Rickford book is We Are an African People. So we'll start a book list for people, but please join me in thanking Damien for this amazing conversation. I so enjoyed it, Damien, and I learned so much. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much enjoy being in dialogue with you. So this was, as always, a pleasure, and I thank everybody who asks great questions. And yeah, yeah, it was just great. Thank you so much.
It was fun, and it was fantastic. So- all right, thank you all, and thank you again, Damien.